A man was arrested overseas and brought to the United States within 72 hours after a sealed federal indictment was unsealed in Manhattan Federal Court. He is accused of coordinating nearly 20 planned terror attacks across the United States and Europe, targeting synagogues, Jewish community centers, and charities in multiple major cities. But none of those attacks were ever carried out. Not a single one. And the reason they never happened is where the story stopped being what it first appears to be. Because the indictment doesn't just describe a lone operative. It points to something far larger operating behind him. Welcome, and thank you for being here watching Frontline with John.
This channel exists for viewers who want real context, not just headlines. And your continued trust means everything. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story that actually matters. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. What the Department of Justice just revealed is not a single arrest. It's the exposure of an entire IRGC external operations network that spent 2 years building Western terror infrastructure while Iran fought a losing war in the Middle East, and that network just collapsed. 24 hours after that indictment became public, the USS Gerald R, the world's largest aircraft carrier, docked at Norfolk Naval Station, completing a 326-day deployment, the longest continuous carrier operation since Vietnam. That ship spent 11 months executing strikes against Iranian positions, command nodes, missile facilities, and proxy networks as part of Operations Epic Fury and Midnight Hammer, the campaign that dismantled what Iran built over 40 years. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth personally greeted the crew. The timing is not coincidental. The arrest and the carrier's return are connected pieces of the same strategic picture. Iran's conventional military has been devastated, its proxy resupply chains severed, and now its asymmetric terror networks in the West are being rolled up in real time. This is what defeat looks like when a regional power loses both the kinetic war and the shadow war simultaneously. And what happens next depends entirely on whether Tehran's new leadership under Mojtaba Khamenei chooses acceptance or revenge. The tactical sequence that produced Friday's arrest began not this week but 2 years ago, when IRGC Quds Force planners, recognizing that direct military confrontation with the United States would likely end in Iranian defeat, initiated what intelligence assessments describe as a distributed external operations campaign. The strategy was simple: preposition operatives, build networks, establish weapon caches, and create plausibly deniable terror cells in Western cities that could be activated if war broke out. Al-Sadi was one node in that network, tasked with European and American operations, specifically targeting Jewish institutions to create sectarian terror that would divide Western publics and complicate U.S. support for Israel. He recruited operatives, conducted reconnaissance, coordinated financing through front companies, and planned attacks designed to maximize casualties. What he didn't know was that Western intelligence services had penetrated his network almost from inception. Every operative he recruited was tracked. Every safe house was surveilled. Every communication was intercepted. The network was allowed to develop just enough to map its full extent before being dismantled. The arrests this week represent the culmination of a 2-year counterintelligence operation that has now decapitated Iran's Western external operations infrastructure. Here's why this matters beyond a single terrorism case. For 40 years, Iran's regional strategy relied on a 3-tier system: conventional military forces for state defense, proxy militias for regional influence, and external terror networks for global reach. The conventional forces were gutted during Epic Fury and Midnight Hammer, when US and Israeli strikes destroyed missile production facilities, drone manufacturing plants, command bunkers, and naval assets. CENTCOM now assesses Iran retains only 10% of its pre-war drone stockpile and has lost the industrial capacity to rebuild quickly. The proxy networks, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen, have been degraded and cut off from resupply. The strikes didn't just hit Iranian forces, they systematically targeted the logistics networks, weapons depots, and transit routes that allowed Tehran to arm its proxies. Without resupply, these groups retain local capability but cannot sustain extended operations or rebuild losses. The third tier, the external operations network, is now being exposed and dismantled through arrests like al-Sadi's. Iran is losing on all three levels simultaneously, which creates a strategic crisis because the regime has no fourth-tier fallback. When conventional forces fail, you activate proxies. When proxies are cut off, you activate external cells. When external cells are rolled up, you have nothing left but rhetoric. The USS Gerald R. Ford's 11-month deployment is the physical manifestation of sustained American naval power that Iran cannot match or counter. 326 days at sea is extraordinary by modern standards, longer than any carrier deployment since the Vietnam era, and it was made possible by the Ford-class carrier's advanced systems that reduce maintenance requirements and increase sortie generation rates. During those 11 months, the Ford's air wing flew thousands of sorties, struck hundreds of targets, and maintained continuous presence that forced Iran to keep air defenses active, disperse assets, and operate under the constant threat of precision strike. The operational tempo was relentless, multiple strike packages daily, suppression of enemy air defenses, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance missions, and close air support for maritime interdiction operations. The Ford didn't just participate in the war, it was the central platform that enabled the air campaign's intensity and duration. No other navy on Earth can sustain that operational picture. Iran tried to counter with anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, and mine warfare, all of which failed to inflict significant damage on US naval assets. The Ford is returning with its crew intact, its aircraft operational, and its mission accomplished. The cost calculus is devastating for Iran. Building the IRGC's external operations network required years of recruiting, training, financing, and positioning operatives in hostile intelligence environments. Al-Sadi and operatives like him represent investments of hundreds of thousands of dollars and countless operational hours. That entire investment just evaporated with his arrest and the dismantling of his network. Compare that to the cost of the counterintelligence operation that took him down: surveillance, signal intercepts, liaison coordination with allied services, all routine intelligence expenditures that Western services conduct continuously. Iran spent heavily to build capability that was neutralized at minimal cost to its opponents. Similarly, the proxy resupply infrastructure that Iran built over decades, the smuggling routes, the weapons caches, the command and control networks, was destroyed in months of sustained airstrikes. Rebuilding that infrastructure under current conditions, with Western intelligence agencies hyper-focused on interdiction and regional states less willing to tolerate Iranian activity, is exponentially more difficult and expensive than the original construction. Iran is facing a strategic resource crisis where it cannot afford to rebuild what it lost at anything approaching the speed it's losing capability. Now let's examine the Iranian domestic response, because what's happening inside Iran reveals the regime's assessment of its own vulnerability. Head of the Iranian judiciary, Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei, announced that courts have adopted a combat stance, where political cases that previously took days now must be finalized and sentences executed within hours. This is not normal legal procedure. This is a regime in crisis mode, terrified of internal collapse, using the judiciary as a blunt instrument to suppress dissent before it can organize. The targets are telling: relatives of protesters killed during January's uprisings, political activists, journalists, anyone who could potentially catalyze broader unrest. The regime survived Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's death during the war and installed his son Mojtaba in a rushed succession process that lacked legitimacy even by the Islamic Republic's standards. Mojtaba Khamenei inherited a country economically devastated, militarily humiliated, and politically fragile. The judiciary's combat stance is an admission that the leadership fears its own population more than it fears external enemies at this moment, because external enemies are currently observing a ceasefire while internal dissent is an immediate existential threat. The diplomatic track shows Iran attempting to salvage some framework for survival through Pakistan-mediated negotiations after the Oman track collapsed. Tehran is pushing a 10-point framework that demands the right to continue domestic uranium enrichment and retain ballistic missile defenses, which are the two capabilities the United States is least likely to accept. Iran's position is understandable from a sovereignty perspective. No country wants foreign powers dictating its domestic energy programs or defense systems. But the strategic reality is that Iran lost the war, and defeated powers do not dictate terms. The US position is that any agreement must include intrusive verification of nuclear activities and significant restrictions on missile programs, precisely because Iran just demonstrated its willingness to use those capabilities aggressively. The gap between positions is enormous, and the Pakistani mediators are attempting to find middle ground that likely doesn't exist. What might bridge the gap is Chinese or Russian pressure on Iran to accept terms. But neither Beijing nor Moscow has strong incentive to expend political capital forcing Iranian concessions when they can simply allow the situation to remain unresolved and thereby tie down US resources and attention in the Middle East. CENTCOM's assessment that Houthi forces are attempting to expand their coastal footprint along the Red Sea despite the ceasefire is significant because it reveals how Iran's proxies are adapting to the new strategic environment. The Houthis cannot operate as they did before the war, launching anti-ship missiles at commercial traffic because US forces will immediately respond with strikes. But they can attempt to physically control more territory, build up positions, and prepare for a future where either the ceasefire collapses or international attention shifts and enforcement becomes less rigorous. This is long game thinking, betting that American political will to maintain pressure will eventually wane and create windows for renewed activity. CENTCOM's public warning about this activity is designed to prevent exactly that outcome by signaling that the US is monitoring and will act if necessary. The question is whether Washington maintains that vigilance 6 months from now, a year from now, or whether domestic political priorities and budget constraints eventually reduce presence and create the space the Houthis are positioning to exploit. The sanctions targeting 11 entities across China, Belarus, and the UAE for providing satellite imagery and procurement support to Iran's ballistic missile program demonstrate that the economic warfare component of the conflict continues even during the ceasefire. These sanctions are designed to prevent Iran from reconstituting the capabilities it lost, to make every component harder to acquire, every transaction more costly, every rebuild effort slower and more expensive. The entities targeted are primarily front companies and intermediaries that facilitate Iran's access to dual-use technologies that have civilian applications but enable military programs. Satellite imagery is essential for missile targeting. Precision components are necessary for guidance systems. By sanctioning the suppliers and facilitators, the US is attempting to create a siege economy where Iran can access only what it can produce domestically, and Iran's domestic industrial base is insufficient to replace what it imported. This is long-term strategic attrition designed to prevent recovery. The information environment shows competing narratives that reflect the underlying strategic positions. Washington's narrative is that the United States achieved a generational shift in Middle Eastern power dynamics by dismantling Iran's 40-year regional project in a matter of months. This narrative serves multiple purposes. It justifies the costs of the campaign to domestic audiences. It reassures regional allies that American security guarantees are credible, and it signals to Iran that resistance is futile. The evidence supporting this narrative is substantial. The proxy networks are degraded. The conventional forces are devastated, the external operations cells are being rolled up, and Iran's new leadership is negotiating rather than escalating. Tehran's counter-narrative is that Iran remains unbowed, that it retains the right to its nuclear program and defensive capabilities, and that it will never accept permanent subordination to Western demands. This narrative is designed to preserve domestic legitimacy and signal to regional actors that Iran is not abandoning its resistance identity despite tactical setbacks. The problem with Tehran's narrative is that it's contradicted by observable reality. The regime is suppressing internal dissent through emergency judicial procedures because it fears domestic collapse, and it's negotiating through Pakistani intermediaries because direct confrontation failed catastrophically. The decision framework facing both sides right now is asymmetric. The United States holds overwhelming military advantage, has demonstrated willingness to use it, and maintains the economic power to sustain pressure indefinitely. Washington's decision is whether to accept a negotiated settlement that leaves some Iranian capabilities intact in exchange for verifiable constraints and monitoring, or whether to continue pressure until Iran either collapses internally or accepts terms approaching unconditional surrender. The first option provides certainty and stability, but leaves potential future threats intact. The second option eliminates the threat more completely, but risks extended commitment of resources, potential humanitarian crisis if the Iranian economy collapses entirely, and unpredictable consequences from regime change. Iran's decision framework is more constrained. Mojtaba Khamenei must balance hardline factions who view any nuclear concessions as betrayal against the practical reality that continued defiance leads to either economic collapse, internal uprising, or renewed military strikes that the country cannot survive. He can choose continued resistance and risk everything, or he can accept constraints that preserve the regime's survival while sacrificing the capabilities that made Iran a regional power. The evidence suggests both sides are exploring the negotiated path while preparing for the breakdown scenario. The Pakistani mediation is genuine, both sides are engaging, and there appears to be recognition that permanent conflict serves neither party's interests. But the gap between positions remains enormous, and neither side has shown willingness to make the concessions necessary for agreement. The US cannot accept Iranian nuclear capability or unrestricted missile programs after Iran just demonstrated its willingness to use those capabilities aggressively. Iran cannot accept permanent subordination of its sovereignty to foreign monitoring and control without triggering internal regime crisis. Something has to give, and what gives determines whether the region enters a period of managed stability or returns to confrontation. The immediate trigger risk is not state-level escalation but asymmetric retaliation for the IRGC operative's arrest. Iran's external operations networks have just been exposed and humiliated. The natural response is to activate remaining cells for retaliatory attacks that demonstrate continued capability and impose costs for the arrests. Western security services are almost certainly operating under heightened alert, expecting exactly this response, which means any attacks attempted in the next 72 hours will likely be intercepted. But the risk exists, and a successful attack that kills civilians in New York or London would create massive political pressure for renewed military action against Iran, potentially collapsing the ceasefire entirely. Tehran's leadership must decide whether revenge attacks are worth that risk or whether preserving the current fragile stability better serves regime survival. The USS Gerald R is now pierside in Norfolk after 11 months of sustained combat operations. The carrier air wing is standing down. The crew is reuniting with families. The operational tempo is decreasing from wartime intensity to peacetime readiness. This is what successful conclusion of military operations looks like when your infrastructure is intact, your personnel are returning home, and your strategic objectives were achieved. Compare that to Iran's situation. Its military is shattered, its supreme leader is dead and replaced by an untested successor, its economy is collapsing, its population is restive, and its external operations networks are being dismantled. The asymmetry is total. What happens next depends on whether Iran's leadership recognizes that asymmetry and acts accordingly, or whether ideological commitment to resistance overrides strategic calculation. The next 72 hours will likely see increased security measures across Western capitals as intelligence services work to preempt any retaliatory attacks from remaining IRGC cells. Watch for additional arrests, for heightened alert levels at potential target sites, and for statements from security officials about disrupted plots. In the Middle East, watch the Red Sea for any indication that Houthi forces are testing CENTCOM's tolerance for territorial expansion, and watch the Pakistan-Iran diplomatic channel for signals about whether the 10-point framework is gaining traction or collapsing. The military forces are postured for rapid response if the ceasefire breaks. U.S. naval assets remain forward deployed. Air assets are positioned at bases throughout the region. The targeting data is current and continuously updated. If Iran chooses escalation, the response will be immediate and overwhelming. If Iran chooses negotiation, the framework exists to explore it. The decision sits in Tehran, and the timeline is measured in days, not weeks. The networks are exposed, the capabilities are degraded, the regime is vulnerable. The next move is theirs.